Okay, well, good morning, church family. It's great to see all of you on this very chilly day. It's always nice, especially when things are a little bit cold and wet, that people are still able to come to church. So it's always encouraging to see that. And it's a funny side note. You know, we used to live in St. Louis, Missouri, where it really does get cold. And so, but again, very quickly we've adjusted. You know, back over in the Midwest, you could be 30 degrees and some people would still be wearing shirts and shorts. But here we are in 58-degree weather in our winter vest. If you haven't already, please go ahead and open up your Bibles to Psalm 90. This is a wonderful passage that I'm looking forward to unpacking together. Before we start, I want to say that yesterday was an incredibly monumental day in the Master Leonardo household. And the reason it was is because yesterday was the first day that we started playing Christmas music in our house. Has anyone else started that yet? Okay, yeah, so a handful of people. Yeah, I see the other faces that are looking in disgust, but you're wrong. It's totally okay to do that. Again, it's always that, weird question of when do you start the Christmas music? Do you do it before Thanksgiving, after Thanksgiving? Some people are crazy that you did even before Halloween is over. But whatever it is, right, at some point we start to move into the season where we feel like it is that holiday time of the year. But every time, especially this year, I'm blown away by how quickly we've gotten to this point already, right? It feels like the year just started, but already we're getting ready for the year to end. It's unbelievable to even be thinking about that. And it feels like for me, I don't know if it is for you, every year goes by faster and faster and faster. I remember growing up in elementary school where it felt like a year was eternity. It just kept on going on and on. And then as I approached high school and then college, it started to go by a little bit faster. And in career stage of life, it went faster. And marriage and having kids is even faster and faster. And we're already at the point where it feels like the year starts and then it just ends like that. And for those of you who are older than me, I can't imagine how quickly time will just continue to move on. Because it just seems like that's the case, right? First, it feels like a year just goes by in the blink of an eye. Then 5 years goes by in the blink of an eye. For some of you, 10 years goes by in the blink of an eye. You might be familiar with that phrase that the days are long, but the years are short. Where you go through life, and before you know it, you look back and you're thinking to yourself, what happened? Right? Where did the time go? And I think if you resonate with that sentiment at all, I think then this passage should really speak to your heart. Because Moses is writing about how we should think about time, right? That naturally speaking, some of us might look at the ways that years have gone on. We look back on how we've lived our life, and some of us might feel regret. Some of us might feel fear or worry about whatever time is left remaining, or maybe it's just the uncertainty that you think, there's so much time in front of me, what's going to happen? But Moses is a man who is writing about the nature of time, and specifically the brevity of time. The fact that life is so short, right? If you know Moses, he was the individual who wrote Genesis to Deuteronomy, right? The Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. He lived through such incredible, significant events in Israel's history. He saw and experienced a lot, and he was an individual who, as he's looking back at his life, the one song or poem that's recorded in the book of Psalms, written by him, is about the brevity of life and how you and I should be thinking about that. And it's more specifically, how is it possible that we as followers of God can find meaning when we know that life is so temporary? And so I think there's going to be a lot for every single one of us here. I hope that you're going to find this helpful. As with many of these Psalms, they're long, so unfortunately we can't cover every verse, but we're going to hit the main ideas so you have time to go back and study it on your own. What he does as he's starting this psalm is he reflects first on God's eternity. Right? He says in verse 1, Lord, you've been our dwelling place in all generations. Right? And he's starting off the psalm before he gets into a lot of other themes with a general declaration. God, you are our home. Right? That's what the dwelling place is. It's a place of refuge. God, you are the place where we feel safe, most secure, where I feel protected. You are our dwelling place, not just for Moses, but for all generations. Right? So for every generation of the Israelites, God is their home and refuge and place of safety and security. All the way into the future, even for us as the church, God is our refuge and place of safety no matter what's going on. And as we've heard in this series, right, if you've been paying attention, this is the value of our theology of God. Why we call to having a God-centered life, because if you rightly understand who he is, his character, his promises, his nature, that's where you can have peace and joy in any situation you're in. Right? That's where we can have a sense of satisfaction, even if things feel terrible, because we know who our God is and we know that we're secure in him. And what Moses is doing in these two verses is he's saying, I trust that you're our refuge for every single generation because you are eternal. From everlasting to everlasting, or as some translations say, from eternity to eternity, you are God. Right? He's describing that if you were to go infinitely in time backwards, you're not going to find an end or a beginning where God was. If you go infinitely in the future, you're not going to find an end to where God finishes. But he has no beginning or no end. And even that description I said helps us to kind of understand his eternity, but it can also be an unhelpful description. Because if you know anything about God's descriptions in the Bible and theology, it's actually that God is timeless. What we mean by that is he's actually outside of the realm of time, right? We can't even comprehend that. That God doesn't experience the passing of time as we do. He doesn't have, as you would call, a succession of moments where you're going from one moment of time to an hour later or an hour later. God is completely outside of time. And we get a little glimpse of this, even though we can't understand it, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. Where there, Peter says, with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Right? For him, it's all the same. It doesn't make sense to us because we experience time, but he doesn't. God has a completely different way of existence than we do. And right, as Christians, as fallible people, we can't fully get that. But I think one human example, which helps at least me grasp a little bit of this truth, is from the movie Interstellar. Right? I think some of you might have seen that. And as far as I've known, I've been told that the research and the way that that movie was done very much reflects our understanding of space and physics and time. Because if you understand physics, time involves matter and space, right? It requires it. And so the more that you have gravity, actually time can be different in one place than another. And so even in that movie, right, maybe you remember there is a scene where several crew members are landing on a certain planet where they think there's another crew member there. They leave one crew member on the surface, and they understand, okay, time's going to be a little bit different down there, so we have to do our mission as fast as we can and get back. And so overall, the mission takes them about 1 hour, right? It's longer than they were expecting because of things that happen. And when they come back to the surface, their crew member became an old man. Right? It was 1 hour for them, but it was 23 years in the rest of the space above them. Right? And then you see how they go through this experience where they're watching these vlogs of their family members. They were only gone an hour, but for the family members, they saw people age and get older. They weren't hearing from them, so they even thought that maybe the crew members had died, all because time was different. Right? And that describes a reality that even time itself requires matter and space, and it can be different depending on how gravity is affecting matter and space. But because God is spirit, because he was the one who created matter and space to begin with, that means he exists even without its byproduct of time. Right? God is timeless in a way that we can't comprehend. And that's not the main focus that Moses is getting at. We're going to see a little bit. But even that truth, if we try to grasp this fact that we can't grasp it, it should cause us to marvel at the nature of our God, right? To think he is so beyond our understanding and our comprehension that with Moses we say, you are a God, you are a dwelling place of all generations from everlasting to everlasting. In a way I can't understand, you are God. And as we've talked about in other Psalms through this series, right, understanding God's timelessness should be another reason that we can rest and trust in his sovereignty, right? Because for us, As we're experiencing life with all of its uncertainties and ups and downs, we sometimes wonder what's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen next week? What's going to happen next year? How are these events that I'm going through going to work out? But because God is eternal and timeless, for him, the future is just as present as the past. Right? For him, in a way that we can't fully understand, he experiences all things together. And even that language fails because that in itself is time language, but that just shows his sovereignty. Right, that his understanding, his experience, his control of every single moment is just as secure as anything else that's already happened. And that's why Christians can rest in his sovereignty. Right? With all the other themes we heard in the other Psalms, all the other truths about his character are reasons that we can rest and have peace and joy, but his eternity as well. That he is fully in control of everything because in some way we can't understand, he experiences it and knows it better than we do. And so in these first two verses, right, Moses is just marveling at God's eternal nature. You are beyond our grasp. You're outside of our existence. You're greater than we can imagine. But that truth causes Moses to then reflect on the contrast, on man's mortality, the fact that we don't exist forever and ever, at least on this earth. And so he says in verse 3, you return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. And maybe you're hearing this for the first time and that means nothing to you. But if you studied your Old Testament, the wording and phrase might sound familiar because he's referencing a passage in Genesis 3, which is about the fall of Adam and Eve, about the nature of when sin first came in. Because in Genesis 3:19, it says, by the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Right, if you know that passage, if you've studied Genesis and know the history of mankind, what's happening there is after Adam and Eve first sinned, right, as they rebelled against God and ate from the tree that they weren't supposed to, that's when the curse of sin first entered the world. That they would no longer have access to the tree of life. They could no longer have a close relation to God. They were banished from the Garden of Eden. And as a result, even though man was initially made to live forever, they would now experience death. Right? Their lifespan would now be finite. There would now be an endpoint to it. And if you read through Genesis, you read a series of these genealogies, right, where it's describing people, their fathers, their sons, how long they lived. And on the surface, those passages can seem so boring and dry. Right? There's been plenty of times as I'm reading through it, maybe for my read through the Bible in a year plan, I gloss over it because it just seems like it's so meaningless. But there's actually a purpose for that. Right? There's several purposes, but one of them is, as you read through these genealogies, you see how people's lifespans begin to get shorter and shorter and shorter. Right? Because for you see that Adam lived 930 years. Right? That's not just there for anything. You eventually hear how Noah, several generations later, lived for 950 years. But then his son Shem lived for 600 years. And then his descendant Shelah lived for 433 years. Then Peleg lived 239 years. Then Abraham lived 175 years. As you go through the Pentateuch, you see Moses lived 120 years. David lived 70 years. Are you seeing a trend there? Right? You're seeing the curse of sin happen in real time as people's lifespans are literally decreasing. And so what Moses is reflecting on in verse 3 is that the death is the curse of sin. Right? When he says in verse 3, return, O children of man, if you know Hebrew, the word man is pronounced Adam, or literally Adam, right? The word man and Adam, it's one and the same. So he's literally repeating, return to dust, children of Adam. Right? He's saying that the fact that we are dying, the fact that we die is a reminder that we are children of Adam. We are children of the one who was cursed with the curse of sin. And so like our Father, we experience the same fate that he does. Right? And so this is a tragedy. This is a sadness that humanity that was meant to live forever, right? And Adam and Eve would have lived forever in the Garden of Eden. Their descendants would have lived forever in that garden. Now, instead, return to dust. And so what he's doing as you go on to verse 5 and 6 is he's basically lamenting the fleeting, passing nature of human life. He says, now, you sweep them away like a flood. And maybe you've heard of the stories of those flash floods where people comment, I was talking to my neighbor or my son or my daughter. I didn't get the notification. Suddenly the flood came, and in one instance, they were knocked off their feet, and I never saw them again. Right? That's the nature of a flash flood. And so he's saying, just in the same way that, I see a human being, and just like that, they're suddenly gone. That life is so fleeting and passing. He says, they're like a dream, or we're like a dream, right? That you remember in the moment, right, as you're dreaming, you're having this experience. Maybe you go on this whole situation, adventure with your life, and then you suddenly wake up and it's gone, right? You don't even think about it. It passed just like that. And the human life is like grass or flowers that could sprout in the morning. Right, in the desert environment like around Israel, you can have these plants that will first pop up because of the sunlight, and then because of the great heat and the lack of water, by the evening they die. Right, they're there for a moment and then they're gone. And it's like what we hear in Psalm 39, verse 5, where it says, a man at his best is a mere breath or vapor. Right, that our life, even if you feel like you're having a long, fulfilled life, just like in the cold air, when you breathe out for a moment, you see a little bit of water vapor, and then it's gone. That's every single one of our lives. That we're here for a moment. It might feel like you're going to be here forever, but Moses is saying, no, eventually we will be gone. And so as it goes on in verse 7, right, he's saying, look, I understand that when I see death, it is a constant reminder that we as humanity are under God's wrath. Right, that's what he says. We're brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath, we're dismayed or we're terrified. Right, he's saying, every single time I feel and experience death or aging, right, every gray or graying hair that you and I have, every body ache, every time we go to a funeral, every time we feel like our body is starting to fail, that is a reminder of the curse of sin. As he goes on to verse 9 and verse 10, even the fatigue that we have is a reminder of sin. He says, we bring our years to an end like a sigh. Just getting to the end of life feels exhausting. If 70 or 80, right, if you live what can be seen as a longer life, their span is a toil and trouble. They're soon gone. Right? Just like in Genesis 3, the curse of sin was that, before, right, Adam knew that the ground would just yield its fruit to him. Right? Work would be easy. You would still have to work, but it would be enjoyable. It would be fine. And the curse of sin was that instead, you would have to sweat and toil to eat bread. Right, so that's what Moses is referencing. We all know the fatigue of life, right? You feel tired because you're working long hours. Maybe you're taking care of a family. Maybe life is hard. And every time we feel that toil, that sorrow, that fatigue of just trying to get through day by day by day, it is a constant reminder of sin. Right, the reminder, too, Moses isn't explicitly referencing this here, but as we see in the rest of the Bible, that apart from Christ, the curse of sin is an eternal death, an eternal toil, an eternal fatigue. And you might be wondering to yourself, why is Moses saying this? Right, the man who was the humblest man to ever live, why is he saying all of these what seems like very depressing facts? Well, I think one of the reasons is we know that Moses is a man who saw and experienced a lot of death in his life. Right? We don't know exactly the context of when Moses wrote this psalm. A lot of scholars probably thought it was during the book of Numbers, if you know that story, where Israel was finally ready. Right? They had been rescued out of Egypt in this very dramatic, miraculous way. They were under the covenant, understood what it meant to follow God and be his people. And they were told, you're going to be God's instrument of judgment over these wicked people, and so you're going to conquer the land and take it over. And then they saw the people, and they got scared. Right? They said, they're too numerous, they're too great, they have these fortresses and walls. There's no way we can do this. Why would God bring us out here? He wants us to die. We should go back and be slaves in Egypt because life was so much better. And as silly as that might sound, right, that was what they experienced. That was their lack of faith. And so God's punishment was, he says, the entire generation, 20 and over, will perish here in the wilderness. And so what happens is, instead of being able to enter the promised land, that whole first generation spent 40 years wandering through the sand, wandering aimlessly wherever God was directing them to no permanent destination or home. And so one by one, you would see as the people would get older and older and eventually die. And maybe you bury someone in the sand, but you continue on, and another person gets older and older and they would die. As another person gets older and older and they would die. And what the book tells us is that over the course of those 40 years, there were 603,554 men that perished, right? Not including the women, that's just the men. And that many people, that entire first generation died before Moses' very eyes. And so that could very much be what Moses was seeing. As he's seeing how their deaths was a consequence of their disbelief in their sin, it's bringing him to the reminder of the general curse of sin. That every single person that he would see that would come after him would eventually perish. But see, Moses is writing this not just to depress you. He has a point, right? Remember how he started verse 1, right? God, you are our refuge. You are our home, right? So he's not just trying to be bleak for the sake of being bleak. He's saying this is reality. This is the reality of our sin, of living in a sin-cursed world. But then he turns his attention to say, there's hope even in this grim life. Even in this life that's passing away. That's temporary, that's brief, that's short, that's under the curse and wrath of God. Even then there's hope. And that's where he turns to. And that's where your and my attention should be as well. In other words, what is it that we as Christians are called to do in this cursed world? It's this. Turn and trust and live for God. Right? This is very reminiscent of the end of Ecclesiastes. This is wisdom literature at its finest. What do we do in this life that seems so futile? Live and honor God in all things. And so first he says in verse 12, what is it that we need to do? Beg God for wisdom. Right, this is a famous passage, but hopefully now that you know the context, there's so much more meaning in these words. He says, so teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Right? Help us understand that our life is fleeting. There's only so many days we have here, and what's the byproduct? Wisdom. Because if you've read Hebrew, you know the background, right? That word chokmah literally means the skill of living well. So biblically, what wisdom is the skill to know. We all have the same time of the day, right? We all have the same 168 hours in the week. But wisdom is knowing how to live, what to prioritize given our limited amount of time. Biblical wisdom is knowing how do you strive to live for God? How do you avoid sin? How do you grow spiritually? How do you make sure you have time to read your word, to spend time here in church, to have meaningful fellowship with believers, to serve one another, to give of your time and resources and evangelize, do all the things that we're called to do while still making enough money to provide for our family, making sure you're discipling your kids, making sure you have a roof over their head, trying to exercise, try to sleep, and maybe sometimes have fun too. Right? That is biblical wisdom. That in this life where you have a finite amount of time, how do you organize your life, live properly, have the right priorities to honor God in all of these different things that's going on? And so this is interesting, right? Moses is saying the start, or one of the starts to have true wisdom in ordering your days, is to remember that your life is short. If you understand that time is limited, that we're not going to be here forever, that becomes a sobering reminder to say, I can't just do whatever I want. I have to make sure I'm prioritizing the things of the Lord. Right? Paul said that in Ephesians 5 famously, verse 15. He says, look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as what? Wise. Making the best use of time because the days are evil. Right? What is he saying there? We as humanly flawed people, if we're not paying attention, if we're not relying on the Lord, if we're not being wise, we will waste our time. And things that are sinful or things that are unhelpful, we will not be focusing on the Lord, and so we need wisdom to make the best use of it. And so what Moses is saying is remember that your life is a vapor, right? Don't just chase adventure because your life is soon going to be over. Don't just chase career titles because your life is soon going to be over. Don't chase a certain retirement size account because your life is soon going to be over. Don't chase living long because your life is soon going to be over. Whatever your situation is, know that your life is coming to an end and live accordingly. And so if you're a believer this morning, if you really understand this, that will change everything about how you're living. Right? It will change what you see as being really important, and it will change what you see as being less important. Because you'll understand that the things of this world you can't take with you into eternity, right? Your house or your desire to get a house is going to pass away. The only thing that will last is our relationship to God and how we lived for his glory. And so what Moses is drawing our attention to is if we really understand the finiteness of life, the brevity of our life, it will give us great clarity for how we live, of what we prioritize as high, what we prioritize as low. And so I briefly ask you all this morning, think about how you've lived this year, which is soon coming to an end. What you prioritized, what you didn't. Do your priorities reflect the truth and understanding that you will die soon? Because that is what Moses says is part of wisdom. Our life is not going to be here forever, so make sure you make your life count in the Lord. And we need to beg God for wisdom. But then secondly, and this was so refreshing to my heart as I hope it is for yours, he says we have to beg God for mercy. Right? Read verse 13. It says, "Return, O Yahweh. Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil." Right? He's saying, God, may you show us mercy. And if you were paying attention to the way he's written this psalm, it's beautiful. Because in verse 3, right, he's referencing the curse of the fall, where God says, return to dust, O man, right? And then what does it say in verse 13? He says, return, O Yahweh. Right? He's asking for the reversal. He says, yes, I know that we were cursed before, but in compassion instead return to us. Show us mercy because it is your character. Right? Moses can say this appeal because he's seen God's character on full display. If you remember that famous account in Exodus 34 where Moses is saying, I want to see your glory, right? I want to see you as you are. I want to understand you. God says, you can't see it directly because you'll die, but I'll let you see a glance of it. And what is the glance of God's character that Moses saw? It's a description of God's character. Right? It says in Exodus 34, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. That was God's description of himself to Moses. Right? That is how Moses was able to see God's glory. And as a side note, if you want to see God's glory, If you want to be in awe and have a right understanding of how to understand life in this crazy world, it's by understanding the character of God. And what Moses was saying is he knew that God was merciful. He knew that he was a God of compassion and love and forgiveness. And so though he was under the curse of sin, and every single one of us was under the curse of sin, and as a result of death, that Moses could say, return, have pity on your servants, that you are a God of compassion and mercy, and if I repent and turn to you, you will forgive me. Right? And isn't that the same truth for all of us as well? That it's because of Jesus Christ and his death on the cross that though we face the curse of sin and the curse of death, that if we turn to his mercy, we can be forgiven. And that we don't have to experience the eternal consequences of our death, though we do experience the physical curse. And so what Moses says here should be so comforting for you and for me. Because he says, look, if you forgive us, if you show pity on your servants, what comes next? You can satisfy us with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Right? Think back to the other messages in the Psalms that we've talked about, where you're hearing that constant refrain, right? That in any circumstance I have joy and I have peace. I can rejoice in you. Why is that the case? Because Moses says, regardless of what else is happening, though we will die, and yes, we will die, if I know your mercy, I can have joy. If I know that I am forgiven in you and you have pity on me, a sinner who deserves nothing but your wrath, then I can have gladness in my soul. And so wherever you may be this morning, as we've said so many times in the Psalms, even if your life is bleak, even if you're getting ready to face death now or it comes unexpectedly to someone you know and you love, you can have joy in your soul if you know God. If you are reflecting and dwelling on his truths, on the fact that you've been forgiven for your sin, you can have a peace and a joy that surpasses all understanding in all situations. And so I ask you to reflect on your life as you think about whatever you're going through. How much does God's love and forgiveness cause you to rejoice in any circumstance you may be facing? Because that's the truth, that's the hope that Christians can hold on to, and that's the wonderful truth that God is causing Moses to write and to delight in as well. That he asks for mercy because he knows God is merciful, and therefore he will rejoice. And as he asks for wisdom, as he asks for mercy and understands more how to live his life, there's one last thing that Moses asks for, and that's strength to live this life. Right, he says in verse 16, let your work be shown to your servants and your glorious power to their children. Right? May you show your power and majesty and glory to all of Israel so they would trust in you. And then verse 17 is so interesting. This is where he ends. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Right? To establish it means to make something permanent. In a world where things are unstable and fail all the time, he's saying, God, may the things that we do last. May you allow our efforts in this life to have purpose and meaning and not be futile and not pass away with death and life. And Moses is recognizing, unless you are the one that's empowering us, everything we do will fail. Unless you are strengthening our efforts, everything we do will crumble. So may you bless us. And you can hear his urgency as he ends his psalm with that repeat. Establish the work of our hands. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Right? It's this reminder that as Israelites back then, as Christians now, the only way we can do work in this life that will last is if it is done in God's strength for God's glory. Right? We need to rely and trust on him. As we've said so many times from this pulpit, right? John 15:5, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Right? Anything we strive to do in this life, to grow in Christ-likeness, to live our lives, our jobs, our service in church in a way that wants to honor the Lord, if we're not doing it in his strength, begging him for help, it will fail because we need him. And you might ask yourself, well, what does that practically look like to be abiding in God and relying in his strength? Well, of course, number one, and this is obvious, right? It means we're asking him for help. We're saying, God, we can't do this apart from you. But more practically, it also means this. God, I can't do this apart from you. And so I will prioritize you and your things over the rest of the things in my life. Right? Because too often in life, right, we can say we're Christians, we can say we want to live for him. But when life gets busy or things get hard, what's the first thing that we neglect so often? It's our time in his word, right? It's prayer. Maybe it's coming to church. Maybe it's pursuing Christian fellowship. Maybe it's serving. Maybe it's wanting to give of our resources to him. There's all these things where we say, God, life is hard. Life is busy. I just don't have time for you. And then maybe we've experienced those moments where we feel like it's so busy and so hectic. So you say, I'm just going to pour all my effort into doing these things and trying to get it done. And nothing seems to get done. But then we have those moments where we say, God, this is impossible. There is so much I have to do. Help me. I want to put you first and trust that you will take care of the rest. And suddenly things that seem impossible get done like that. Right? And we're putting God first, and we're saying, I want to surrender this to you first. And without ways that we can explain or make sense of it, life just seems to work out. And I'm not saying that that will happen every single time, right? That you read your Bible more and you get the promotion you're looking for. But when we put the Lord first, when we are saying, God, I can only do this in your strength by putting you first, we can trust that whatever else happens will be empowered by him. Now, I love this quote by Martin Luther, right? The great reformer who was trying to revive the gospel in an age in which it was lost. And he was a very busy man if you didn't know his life, right? Many things going on. People wanted to kill him. He was being summoned to various things he didn't want to go to. He was trying to still preach the gospel. And he said this, I have so much to do that I will spend the first 3 hours in prayer. Right? A man who was busier than any of us would ever be would say, I know that there's so much going on that I need to rely on the Lord. I need to ask him for help. I need to make sure that I'm doing it not in my strength, but in his. And the same is true for you and me. We need God to establish the work of our hands. We need him to empower us and give his favor to us. And that's only going to happen if we are putting him first. And so I ask, as you're living your life, are you putting God first? Are you asking him for his favor and his help? Or are you trying to just get through life on your own? Because if you are, I don't need to ask you how that's going. I think you already know. And so I think hearing a message like this, there can be a lot of different responses. Right? I don't know the last time you read Psalm 90. Maybe this is the first time and you're thinking, wow, this is very different than what I've read in the Gospels. And I think when you hear the reality about time, about using it well, about the brevity of life, maybe you do feel regret, maybe you feel hope, I don't know. I know when I think about the passing of time, even this year I had to reflect on it. Because one of my childhood friends unexpectedly died. He was 32 years old. I assumed, as many of our other friends assumed, that he would be around for a very long time. And just like that, he's gone. And I know for me, there's a natural feeling of regret of I should have said more, I could have done more, we could have had more time together. All these things that I wish. But then I'm reminded and I'm encouraged by this passage that yes, life is fleeting and passing. We can't control the past. We can't change the past. But in the Lord's strength and empowerment, we can live the present and the future for Him. As long as we are surrendering it to Him, whatever takes place, we trust and we hope that God will be glorified. And so I hope this morning, as you finish this morning, as we get ready to sing one more song in praise of Him, you are reminded that whatever's taking place in your life already, if you are in Christ, every sin can be forgiven. Every sin is redeemed. And whatever takes place in this life, you have an eternity of joy and of peace and of bliss as you worship Him. And so as we live the rest of this very short life, whether it's a week, a year, 40 years, may you live it in His strength for His glory, because that's all we have, and that's all we can do. Let's pray.